The airport was packed with the usual chaos. People hurrying to their gates, last-minute announcements crackling through the speakers, and the steady hum of luggage wheels rolling across the tile floor. It was just another busy day at the airport, where strangers from all walks of life crossed paths, each carrying their own stories, their own destinations. But for one particular flight, something was about to happen that no one on board would ever forget. James Carter adjusted the strap of his carry-on bag as he walked toward the boarding gate. He had taken countless flights before, but today, something felt different. Maybe it was the way people stared at him a little too long, or the uneasy glances he received as he stood in line to board the plane. He was used to it. Being a black man in certain places came with a level of silent judgment he had learned to ignore. But today, the weight of those stares felt heavier than usual. As he stepped onto the plane, he gave a polite nod to the flight attendant before moving down the narrow aisle in search of his seat. He barely noticed the woman already seated in the row he was assigned to. She was in her mid-50s, with sharp, calculating eyes and an air of self-importance. Her pearl necklace rested perfectly against her neatly pressed blouse, and she clutched her designer handbag like it held something far more valuable than just her belongings. James stopped next to her seat, checking the number above. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely. "I believe this is my seat." The woman looked up, her expression instantly shifting from neutral to one of clear disapproval. Her lips pursed tightly, and she took a sharp breath, as if the mere presence of James standing next to her was offensive. She glanced toward the flight attendant at the front of the cabin before turning back to James. "There must be some mistake," she said coldly. "Are you sure you're supposed to be sitting here?" James kept his composure, nodding. "Yes, ma'am. 23B right here." The woman's eyes narrowed. "You people always cause problems," she muttered under her breath, but loud enough for James to hear. James felt his jaw tighten, but he wasn't about to let her ignorance ruin his day. He exhaled slowly, reminding himself that reacting emotionally wouldn't change her mindset. Instead, he set his bag down and prepared to take his seat. But the woman wasn't done. She suddenly waved down the flight attendant, her voice rising with exaggerated concern. "Excuse me. Yes, you, this man is making me uncomfortable. I don't feel safe sitting next to him." A few nearby passengers turned their heads at the commotion. The flight attendant, a young woman with a tired but patient smile, approached cautiously. "Ma'am, is there an issue?" The woman gestured toward James, as if presenting evidence in court. "Yes. I don't know who he is, but I don't feel comfortable with him sitting next to me. Could you please move him somewhere else?" James closed his eyes briefly, gathering his patience. He had dealt with people like this before. People who saw his skin color before they saw him as a person. But before he could respond, the murmurs around them grew louder. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others watched in awkward silence. The flight attendant hesitated, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. "Ma'am, I can't move a passenger unless there's a valid reason." "Isn't my safety a valid reason?" the woman snapped. "You're telling me that in this whole plane, there's not a single other seat available?" James took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice even. "Ma'am, I assure you, I'm just here to take my flight like everyone else. There's no reason to feel unsafe." But the woman's expression hardened. "I don't trust you," she said bluntly. "You look suspicious." A heavy silence fell between them. James felt the weight of a dozen eyes on him, waiting to see how he would react. His pulse remained steady, his breathing calm. He had no intention of arguing with this woman. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. With quiet confidence, he flipped it open, revealing his official identification. The small golden letters gleamed under the cabin lights. 3 letters stood out boldly against the dark leather. "BI." The woman's face drained of color in an instant. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. It was as if someone had pressed a pause button on her entire demeanor. The arrogance, the false fear, the manufactured sense of entitlement. All of it froze in that single moment. Passengers around them began to whisper, their eyes darting between James and the woman. The flight attendant, who had remained professional throughout the ordeal, suddenly straightened, her gaze flicking down to the badge and then back up to James. James let the silence hang for just a moment longer before finally speaking. His voice as calm as ever. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm not just any passenger. I work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation." He closed the wallet and slipped it back into his pocket. "Now, would you still like to report me as a threat?" The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her fingers gripped the edge of her handbag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The confidence she had displayed just moments ago had crumbled entirely. The flight attendant, now fully aware of the situation, cleared her throat. "Ma'am, unless there's a legitimate issue, I suggest you allow Mr. Carter to take his seat." The woman swallowed hard, glancing around as if searching for support. But the nearby passengers, who had once been passive spectators, now wore expressions of quiet disapproval. Some shook their heads. Others looked away in embarrassment for her. She had no choice but to nod, her voice barely a whisper. "Fine." James finally sat down, adjusting his seatbelt without another word. He could feel the woman's discomfort beside him, but he no longer cared. He had encountered people like her before, and he knew he would encounter them again. But today, she had learned a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. As the plane doors closed and the engines roared to life, James leaned back in his seat, gazing out the window. The city lights below twinkled like stars, a reminder that the world was vast and full of different people, different stories. And today he had rewritten one. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as the flight attendants moved through the aisles, making final checks before takeoff. The woman beside James had gone completely silent, staring straight ahead as if pretending he didn't exist. Her fingers still clutched her handbag tightly, her knuckles pale from the grip. James didn't look at her. He had nothing else to say. Instead, he focused on the faint vibrations of the aircraft as it taxied down the runway. The tension between them remained thick, but James had learned a long time ago how to sit in silence and let other people deal with the weight of their own choices. He wasn't about to carry this woman's guilt for her. As the plane began its ascent, James leaned back and closed his eyes. His job required him to stay alert, always aware of his surroundings, but he also knew when to let a moment pass. His badge might have silenced the woman for now, but he could still feel her discomfort radiating off her. She was shifting slightly in her seat, glancing at him out of the corner of her eye, probably still trying to process what had just happened. A few rows ahead, a middle-aged man in a business suit gave James a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't much, just a subtle gesture, but James recognized it for what it was. An unspoken agreement that they had all just witnessed something ugly. James returned the nod before looking away, uninterested in making a bigger scene than what had already happened. The flight attendant returned a few minutes later, handing out drinks and small snack packets. When she reached their row, she paused briefly, her eyes flickering toward James. He could tell she was debating whether to say something, but instead, she simply set a small cup of water and a bag of pretzels on his tray table with a quiet, "Let me know if you need anything, sir." James gave her a polite nod, appreciating the small but meaningful gesture. The woman beside him, however, seemed unable to let things go. She took her drink with stiff hands, lifting it to her lips but not drinking. James could feel her frustration simmering just beneath the surface, as if she was waiting for the right moment to say something else. And then she did. "I don't know why people like you always feel the need to throw your power around," she muttered under her breath. James exhaled slowly, keeping his gaze on the tray table in front of him. "People like me," he repeated calmly. She shifted uncomfortably. "You know what I mean," she said, her voice lower now, as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. "You didn't have to do that. You embarrassed me." James let out a short laugh, finally turning to look at her. "You embarrassed yourself," he said plainly. "I was just sitting in my assigned seat. You were the one who made a scene." She huffed, stirring her drink with a tiny plastic straw. "I was just looking out for my own safety." James tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You were looking out for your own comfort," he corrected. "There's a difference." She didn't respond to that. Instead, she shifted again, adjusting her blouse as if it had suddenly become too tight. James could tell she wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like him. She had expected him to comply, to accept her discomfort as a valid excuse for pushing him aside. For the first time, she actually looked at him, not just as a nameless black man she had judged, but as a person. And she didn't seem to like what she saw. James turned back toward the window, letting the conversation die there. He had no interest in changing her mind. People like her rarely changed overnight, and it wasn't his job to teach her a lesson. The flight continued in uneasy silence, the occasional ding of a seatbelt sign and soft murmurs of conversation filling the space between them. A few hours passed, and the cabin lights dimmed as passengers settled in for the remainder of the trip. Some people read books, others scrolled through their phones, and a few had already dozed off, their heads leaning against the small airplane windows. James pulled out his phone, scrolling through some emails while keeping an eye on the movements around him. It was second nature. Years of working for the FBI had trained him to observe details that others overlooked. The way a passenger kept glancing toward the back of the plane, the nervous tapping of fingers against an armrest, the shifting of a bag from one lap to another. It all meant something. The woman beside him had grown noticeably quieter, but James could sense her thoughts still churning. She had spent the first half of the flight judging him, and now she was likely trying to justify her behavior to herself. Then out of nowhere she spoke again. "You don't act like an FBI agent," she said, her voice quieter this time. James raised an eyebrow but didn't turn to her. "And how exactly does an FBI agent act?" She hesitated, clearly realizing she had walked into her own trap. "I don't know. I wasn't expecting it." James smirked slightly. "You weren't expecting someone like me to be in law enforcement." She didn't answer, but the silence spoke for her. James sighed, shaking his head. "That's the problem," he said. "People like you don't expect us to be in these positions. And when we are, it makes you uncomfortable." She fidgeted, her fingers tracing the rim of her empty cup. "It's not like that," she muttered, but even she didn't sound convinced by her own words. James didn't press further. He wasn't interested in dragging this conversation out any longer than necessary. He had already made his point. As the flight continued, he turned his attention back to his phone, but something still felt off. A strange energy in the air, an unease that had nothing to do with the woman beside him. It wasn't just the awkward tension between them. Something else had shifted on the plane. He glanced around, scanning the rows ahead and behind him. A man a few seats up had his hood pulled low over his face, barely moving. Another passenger, sitting near the emergency exit, kept glancing toward the flight attendants as if waiting for the right moment to act. James had been trained to recognize patterns of behavior that signaled trouble. And right now, his instincts were telling him something wasn't right. He straightened slightly, his senses sharpening. The woman beside him must have noticed his change in posture because she gave him a suspicious glance. "What is it?" she asked. James didn't answer immediately. He continued watching, studying, piecing things together in his mind. The way one of the men subtly exchanged glances with another across the aisle. The way another passenger shifted their bag, reaching inside for something. James' pulse remained steady, but his body was already preparing for what might come next. "Stay in your seat," he murmured, barely loud enough for the woman beside him to hear. She frowned. "What?" James didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his jacket, his fingers grazing over his badge once more. He hadn't expected this flight to be anything more than an uncomfortable encounter with a prejudiced stranger. But now, something much bigger was unfolding right in front of him. James kept his expression neutral, but his mind was already working fast. His gut told him something was off, and years of experience had taught him never to ignore that feeling. He casually shifted in his seat, pretending to adjust his jacket while discreetly scanning the cabin again. The man in the hoodie was still sitting stiffly, his hands resting on his knees. The other passenger, the one by the emergency exit, had stopped looking at the flight attendants and was now staring straight ahead, almost too still. James knew the signs. He had seen them before. There was a certain kind of tension people carried when they were about to do something reckless, something dangerous. And right now he was surrounded by it. The woman next to him must have noticed his sudden shift in focus. She leaned slightly toward him, her voice quiet but still edged with suspicion. "What's going on?" James didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his cup of water and took a slow sip, using the movement as a cover to look around once more. He spotted a flight attendant standing near the front, speaking with another crew member. They were unaware of what was happening, or rather what might happen. James turned slightly toward the woman beside him, keeping his voice low. "I need you to stay calm and do exactly as I say." Her eyes widened, and for the first time since their encounter began, she looked genuinely nervous. "Why? What's wrong?" "I don't have time to explain," James said. "Just trust me." She let out a shaky breath, clearly unsure of what to do with that request. A few hours ago, she had tried to have him removed from the flight. Now he was telling her to trust him. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. James didn't wait for her to respond. Instead, he subtly reached down and unfastened his seatbelt, preparing himself for whatever was about to unfold. He knew he had to act carefully. Making a wrong move could put everyone on board in danger. The man in the hoodie shifted slightly, his hands disappearing into his lap. Another movement caught James' eye. A different man, a few rows ahead, tapping his fingers rhythmically against his leg. It was a signal. James had seen this kind of coordination before. His heart rate remained steady, but his focus sharpened. If this was what he thought it was, he needed to stop it before it escalated. He leaned toward the woman again, his voice barely above a whisper. "If something happens, don't panic. Stay in your seat. Understand?" She swallowed hard, nodding. "You're scaring me." "Good," James said simply. "That means you'll listen." Then it happened. The man in the hoodie suddenly stood up, his movements quick and deliberate. At the same time, the man near the emergency exit rose as well, reaching into his jacket. The murmurs in the cabin died instantly, passengers turning their heads, confused. Some assumed it was just someone stretching after a long flight. Others, however, could feel the shift in the air. James was already moving. In one smooth motion, he stood up, stepping into the aisle just as the hooded man reached into his backpack. James didn't need to see what was inside to know it wasn't good. "Sit down," James said firmly, his voice carrying just enough authority to make the man hesitate. The hooded man froze for just a second, his eyes flicking toward James, surprised. He hadn't expected resistance this early. James could see it, the moment of hesitation, the flicker of doubt. The other man near the emergency exit wasn't hesitating, though. He pulled something from his pocket, his hand gripping it tightly. James moved before he could think twice. He reached into his jacket, pulling his badge free and flashing it in one swift motion. "FBI," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "I suggest you rethink whatever you're about to do." The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the cabin, passengers shifting in their seats, some clutching their armrests. A flight attendant let out a startled noise but didn't move. The hooded man's grip on his backpack tightened, his knuckles turning white. The man near the emergency exit froze, his hand still inside his jacket. For the first time, the plan they had so carefully constructed was unraveling before it could even begin. James didn't move from his position. He kept his stance firm, his eyes locked onto the men. He could see the calculations running through their minds. What now? Abort. Continue. The seconds stretched painfully long, the entire cabin waiting in silence. The woman beside James hadn't moved, her hands gripping the armrests so tightly that her nails dug into the fabric. Then, without warning, the hooded man dropped his backpack onto the floor. The other man, the one near the emergency exit, slowly pulled his hand from his jacket, empty. James didn't lower his guard. Not yet. He had seen people bluff before. He had seen situations turn bad in an instant. But right now he had the advantage. A voice came from behind, a deep, authoritative tone. "Sir, what's going on here?" James didn't turn immediately. He knew it was one of the flight attendants, probably the head of the cabin crew. "Call the captain," James instructed, his voice still calm but firm. "Tell them we need law enforcement at the gate when we land." The flight attendant hesitated only for a second before nodding and rushing toward the cockpit. The two men, now exposed, remained frozen. They knew they were trapped. There was nowhere to go, no way to escape without making things worse. James finally took a step forward, lowering his voice just enough so only they could hear. "You picked the wrong flight." Neither man responded. But James could see it, the silent surrender in their eyes. The moment they realized they had lost before they even got started. The rest of the cabin remained eerily quiet, passengers still holding their breath, waiting for something more to happen. James didn't take his eyes off the two men. He wouldn't. Not until he was sure this was over. But something in his gut told him it wasn't. Not yet. The cabin remained frozen in silence, passengers holding their breath, eyes darting between James and the two men. The hum of the engines was the only sound filling the tense air. Every second stretched unbearably long, thick with the weight of uncertainty. James had seen standoffs before, situations where one wrong move could send everything spiraling. And right now he was standing at the edge of one. The man in the hoodie, his face shadowed beneath the fabric, kept his hands hovering near his backpack, his fingers twitching. The other man, near the emergency exit, was still standing rigid, his posture tense like a cornered animal deciding whether to fight or flee. They hadn't backed down completely yet, but James could tell they were thinking, calculating. A sharp inhale came from behind James. The woman who had been sitting beside him hadn't moved, but he could feel her eyes on him. She had spent the first half of the flight trying to get him removed. Now, she was relying on him to keep her safe. The irony didn't amuse him. James didn't lower his voice when he spoke again, making sure the entire cabin heard him. "I already called for law enforcement to meet us at the gate. You have two choices," he said evenly, his voice controlled, firm. "You can sit down, let this end quietly, or you can make a mistake that will change your lives forever." The hooded man's breath came faster, shallower. His fingers curled around the edge of the seat in front of him, knuckles tightening. James knew that body language well, the desperate energy of someone realizing they were losing control of a situation they thought they had planned out perfectly. The other man, the one by the emergency exit, shifted slightly. James caught the movement instantly, his muscles tensing. He wasn't pulling anything out of his jacket, no weapon, no last-ditch effort to regain control, but he was preparing for something. Maybe a fight, maybe a run for it. A flight attendant's voice crackled through the intercom, her tone strained but professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. We are working to resolve a situation. Cabin crew, please stand by." James didn't flinch, but he knew that announcement had just raised the tension even higher. Passengers weren't just curious anymore. They were frightened. The reality of what was happening was setting in. A few people clutched their armrests. A mother across the aisle pulled her child closer. A man near the back whispered something to his seatmate, his expression pale. James needed to end this before it escalated. He took a slow step forward, angling his body slightly toward the emergency exit row, cutting off any potential escape route. The movement made the man flinch, his fingers twitching at his side, but he didn't run. Not yet. You're being watched, James continued, keeping his voice controlled. Air marshals are trained to spot threats on flights. Law enforcement will be waiting the second we land. You have nowhere to go. The hooded man's jaw clenched, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. His plan was falling apart, slipping through his fingers faster than he could recover it. The reality was setting in. There was no way out that didn't end with cuffs around his wrists. The other man, though, wasn't done. James saw the shift before it even fully happened. A quick, sharp inhale, a slight bend in the knees, a shift in weight. It was the kind of movement someone made when they were about to run. Or worse. Before the man could act, James moved. In a single sharp motion, James lunged forward, gripping the man's wrist just as he tried to dart toward the emergency exit. The sudden force sent both of them stumbling against the seats, passengers gasping as the struggle unfolded in the cramped aisle. The man grunted, trying to wrench his arm free, but James was faster, stronger. The cabin exploded into noise. Someone screamed. A flight attendant shouted for everyone to stay in their seats. The hooded man jolted as if he was about to intervene, but one sharp look from James stopped him cold. James twisted the man's arm behind his back, using the leverage to push him down into the nearest seat. The man thrashed, but James didn't loosen his grip. "Don't be stupid," James warned, his voice a low growl. "It's over." For a moment, the man kept struggling, his breath ragged, eyes darting around the cabin as if looking for a way out. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. Slowly, the fight drained out of him. His body sagged slightly, his breathing still heavy but less frantic. James held him there, keeping the pressure just enough to make sure he wouldn't try anything else. The hooded man remained frozen in place, his hands still gripping his backpack. James flicked his gaze toward him. "Sit down," he ordered, his voice sharp. The man hesitated, looking like he was about to argue, but then, he did. His legs gave out, and he collapsed into his seat, eyes darting toward the front of the plane, maybe hoping for some kind of miracle that would undo the mess he'd gotten himself into. But there was no undoing it now. The weight of the entire situation seemed to crash down on the cabin all at once. The tension in the air remained thick, but it was shifting, turning into something else. Relief. The realization that the danger might have just passed. James didn't relax. Not yet. He kept his grip firm, his breathing steady. He wasn't letting go until he knew for sure that the situation was fully under control. A flight attendant's voice, still shaky but strong, cut through the chaos. "The captain has been informed. Authorities will be waiting for us when we land." James nodded slightly. That was exactly what needed to happen. But even as he kept the man pinned in place, even as the cabin slowly began to settle, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't completely over. Something about this still felt unfinished. James kept his grip firm, his instincts telling him not to let his guard down yet. The cabin had settled into uneasy silence, passengers still on edge, their gazes darting between him and the two men. The man he had restrained near the emergency exit had stopped fighting, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. The hooded man sat stiffly in his seat, his hands still resting on his backpack. Something about that still didn't sit right with James. The flight attendants were doing their best to maintain control, whispering into their radios, likely communicating with the captain. James caught a glimpse of one of them near the front, pale-faced but focused. They were probably relaying information to the authorities waiting on the ground. But something still felt wrong. James had been in enough high-pressure situations to know when the danger was truly over, and this didn't feel like that moment. He shifted slightly, his grip tightening on the restrained man. The hooded guy was too quiet, too still, his fingers pressing into the fabric of his backpack like he was waiting for something. James followed his gaze, straight toward the overhead compartments. His stomach dropped. That's when the turbulence hit. The plane jolted violently, a sudden dip that sent a ripple of gasps through the cabin. A flight attendant stumbled, grabbing onto a seat for support. Passengers braced themselves, hands gripping armrests. The plane steadied quickly, but it was enough of a distraction. James's head snapped back toward the hooded man. Too late. In one swift motion, the man shoved his backpack to the floor and kicked it down the aisle. Slid fast, stopping a few rows ahead. His movements were quick, practiced, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. James's heart pounded. The restrained man used the distraction to lurch forward, trying to break free. James reacted instantly, twisting his grip to keep him locked down. But his attention was divided now. The backpack. What was in it? A chorus of fearful voices filled the cabin as passengers saw what had happened. Some gasped. Others shrank into their seats, eyes wide with panic. The flight attendants froze, their faces flashing with fear as they, too, processed what they had just seen. James acted fast. Nobody move. His voice was sharp, cutting through the rising panic. Stay calm. His mind was racing. The backpack was a wild card. It could be nothing or it could be the real danger. And the worst part, he was too far away to check it himself. He looked back at the hooded man. His face was no longer blank. There was something else there now, a flicker of satisfaction. That's when James realized it. They weren't just trying to cause chaos. They had planned for this. The turbulence, the backpack, it was all part of something bigger. And he was running out of time to figure it out. James' pulse pounded in his ears as he locked eyes with the hooded man. The look on his face wasn't fear, wasn't defeat. It was something else. Satisfaction. Like he had already won. James couldn't afford to waste another second. He shoved the restrained man fully into the seat, twisting his wrist just enough to make sure he stayed down. Don't move, he growled before shifting his focus. The backpack. It had stopped a few rows ahead, just lying there. Passengers were whispering, some gasping, their fear growing with each passing moment. A few people started shifting in their seats, trying to get away from the bag, unsure of what to do. The flight attendants looked frozen, their eyes darting between James and the backpack. James took a slow step forward, keeping his voice calm, controlled. Nobody touch it, he ordered. The hooded man let out a slow breath, his lips curling into something between a smirk and a grimace. He still hadn't moved. He was watching, waiting. James knew he had to act fast. If that bag had something dangerous inside, anything that could harm the passengers, he had to neutralize it now. He moved carefully, stepping past the stunned travelers, his eyes locked on the backpack. He could see the way it slumped slightly. Nothing too heavy inside. No visible wires. No ticking. But that didn't mean it was safe. He crouched slowly, steadying himself as he reached forward. His fingers brushed against the fabric just as. Loud click. James' body went rigid. For one terrifying second, the entire plane felt like it had stopped moving. The noise had come from behind him, near the hooded man. James didn't turn immediately. He stayed perfectly still, his hand still resting on the bag. Then he heard the voice. I wouldn't do that if I were you. James finally turned his head, just enough to see. The hooded man had pulled something from his pocket. Small, black, a tiny trigger-like device clenched in his hand. His finger was hovering over the button. A remote detonator. A ripple of gasps filled the cabin. Someone whimpered. A flight attendant clapped a hand over her mouth. James' mind was already racing. The backpack was in his hands, but if it was wired to a trigger, then it wouldn't matter if he had control of it. This guy had planned for that. He wanted James to grab it. James exhaled slowly, keeping his expression blank. You press that button and you go down with the rest of us. The hooded man gave him a slow, knowing look. I think you're bluffing. James met his gaze, unwavering. Am I? For a second, neither of them moved. Then out of nowhere the woman, his seatmate, the same one who had tried to get him kicked off the flight, spoke. Her voice was shaking, but she was staring straight at the hooded man. You don't want to do this. The hooded man's fingers twitched, but he didn't look at her. He was still watching James. James seized the moment. You're not getting off this plane, he said, his voice steady, firm. You know that. The second we land, you're done. Press that button, and you make things worse for yourself. The hooded man's jaw clenched. The first sign of doubt. James pushed harder. Whatever plan you had, it's over. You lost. You want to take the coward's way out, go ahead. But you won't win. The man swallowed, his hand still hovering over the button. The entire plane was holding its breath, waiting. Then, without warning, the emergency lights flickered. A loud beep rang through the cabin. The captain's voice came over the speakers. This is your captain speaking. Law enforcement is waiting at the gate. Remain in your seats. I repeat, remain in your seats. The hooded man's grip on the device faltered. And in that split second of hesitation, James lunged. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it sharply. The device slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor. In the same motion, James shoved him back into the seat, pinning him down. The man struggled, but James had the upper hand. A flight attendant rushed forward, kicking the detonator away. 2 passengers jumped in to help, holding the hooded man's arms as he thrashed. James wasted no time. He yanked zip ties from a crew member's pouch and secured the man's wrists, tightening them until he couldn't move. The other man, the one near the emergency exit, had stopped fighting altogether, slumped in his seat, defeated. The tension in the cabin remained thick, but James knew it was over. The flight attendants were already on the radio, relaying updates. Passengers were whispering, some still trembling, others exhaling in pure relief. James sat back, taking a deep breath. He looked toward the woman beside him. She was staring at him, wide-eyed, her expression unreadable. Then softly she spoke. I was wrong about you. James let out a short breath, almost a laugh. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. Outside the window, flashing lights filled the runway. The plane was landing. It was over. Or at least that's what James thought. Until his phone buzzed. He frowned, pulling it from his pocket. A message flashed on the screen. An unknown number. Nice work, Agent James. But this wasn't the real threat. James' breath caught. He looked up, scanning the cabin. Everything seemed normal now. The danger had passed. The suspects were restrained. The passengers were safe. But suddenly he wasn't so sure. His grip tightened around his phone. Something bigger was coming. And this was just the beginning. James sat still for a moment, staring at the message on his phone. The weight of everything that had just happened was still settling in. But now there was something new creeping in, unease. His instincts told him this wasn't over, even though it should have been. Passengers were finally starting to relax, whispering to one another about what had just unfolded. Some still looked shaken, others relieved. Flight attendants moved cautiously through the cabin, checking on people and offering reassurances that law enforcement would be waiting as soon as they reached the gate. James glanced toward the front of the plane. The woman who had been so desperate to have him removed earlier was still watching him, her expression unreadable. Maybe she was trying to process the fact that the man she had unfairly judged had just saved everyone on board. Maybe she was feeling guilty. Either way, James didn't care. He had bigger things to worry about. His eyes drifted toward the hooded man, now zip-tied and slumped in his seat, staring at the floor. His accomplice, the man James had restrained near the emergency exit, sat in silence as well. Neither had spoken since their plan fell apart. James leaned in slightly. "Who are you working with?" he asked, keeping his voice low. The hooded man didn't look up. He didn't even flinch. But James caught the way his fingers twitched slightly. Just a small movement, barely noticeable. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Satisfaction. James' grip on his phone tightened. The message. Whoever had sent it knew exactly what had happened on this flight. That meant they were watching. The plane finally came to a stop at the gate, the hum of the engines fading. Outside, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the tarmac. Several uniformed officers were already waiting, their postures tense and ready. It wasn't every day that a mid-air security threat landed right in their laps. The flight attendants moved quickly to open the door, their voices more composed now. James stayed seated, watching as the authorities stepped on board. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man in an FBI windbreaker, immediately locked eyes with him. James didn't need to introduce himself. His badge had already done the talking earlier. "Agent James," the officer said with a nod. "We'll take it from here." James stood, stepping aside as the officers moved in to take custody of the suspects. The hooded man remained silent as they hauled him to his feet, but just as he was being led past James, he spoke under his breath. "This isn't over." James didn't react. He simply watched as the two men were escorted off the plane, their footsteps heavy against the narrow aisle. Passengers leaned away as they passed, some glaring, others refusing to even look. James exhaled. It was over. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. The woman who had been so vocal earlier suddenly stepped closer, hesitant. Her face was no longer twisted in frustration or annoyance. Now she just looked ashamed. "I misjudged you," she said quietly. James looked at her, but he didn't respond right away. He had no interest in humiliating her or making a scene. Instead, he just gave a small nod. "You did," he said simply. She swallowed, looking like she wanted to say more, but no words came. Instead, she turned and made her way toward the exit, disappearing with the rest of the passengers. James finally stepped off the plane himself, the cool night air hitting his skin as he walked onto the jet bridge. The lead officer from earlier was waiting for him. "We'll need your statement," the man said. James nodded. "I figured." The officer studied him for a moment, then lowered his voice. "We ran a trace on that number you got a message from." James raised an eyebrow. "And?" The officer shook his head. "It was a burner. Untraceable." James wasn't surprised. Whoever was behind this wasn't sloppy. This wasn't just some random attack. This was coordinated. And the fact that someone had been able to contact him directly in real time meant they had access to information they shouldn't have had. As James walked through the airport, he could feel the eyes on him. The remaining passengers who had been on the flight with him whispered as he passed, some offering nods of gratitude, others still too shaken to say anything at all. By the time he reached the exit, his phone buzzed again. Another message. "This was just a test. You were never the target." James stopped in his tracks. His stomach clenched. Test. His mind raced through the events of the past few hours. The suspects, their plan, the way they had reacted. The hooded man's confidence. The strange message. It wasn't adding up. If this had been a test, then what was the real attack? And worse, who was it meant for? James didn't have all the answers yet. But one thing was clear. Whatever was coming next, it was going to be much bigger.